violate our normal notions of how combination works. Maybe this can work with subjectivity as well. Obviously, physical conditions near absolute zero we need for Bose-Einstein condensates are not in the brain. It's just an analogy. But if there are certain maybe phenomenal conditions, which again this would be breaking away from a one-to-one Russellian view, if there's some different laws of phenomenal combination that could work, then the analogy could be quite apt. This may exactly be how subjects combine. In any case, I think that they do make a better analogy than, say, interaction with waves, which has come up a few times. I'm not picking on you here, Greg, but this was the quote that really kind of brought this to my mind when you say, imagine 12 waves flowing toward the beach, have them meet, and 12 waves combine into a single wave. The thing of it is that when that wave then does crash upon the beach, you might parallel this to the death of the macro subject. It doesn't decohere back into its original 12 constituent waves. All those original waves and the super wave are just gone forever.
They do when they meet in the water.
Well, when they meet in the water, they return back and become the 12 that they originally were. Well, okay. Well, I'm thinking more here of a death scenario, because what I want to sort of suggest is that we need to not just account for the kind of origin of subjects, but also what's going to happen when we die. What happens to those, to that, however it ends up happening, if the micro turns into the macro, when the macro ceases to function, it seems like we want some sort of conservation of consciousness, a zero-sum game picture. I would think we want to prefer a view in which the end of the super subject does not result in some net loss of consciousness from the world, and it would probably be best if all of the ultimates kind of went back to being the way that they were, little micro subjects. So yeah, that would result in decoherence, and yeah, they'd all go back to their unbound micro-experientiality. So moving on from some suggestions on subjects, some suggestions on experience, and how some low-level micro-experiences could result in, again, technicolor phenomenology and whatnot. Again, to begin with the question, how are higher-level experiences derived from lower-level ones? As he says, there's a large number of experiential primitives. This is just basically the palette problem we've been talking about. And he says, well, and you can't put qualia ends to end. So his sort of, I guess his claim here is that we can only solve this derivation problem if we credit the ultimates with the origina phenomenology, form an adequate basis for the full body human mind. Otherwise, we're going to have some input from the outside, and then we have given up kosher emergence. Looks like I dropped a parenthesis again. Sorry. So in other words, micro-experience, even if it does exist, beginning view, cannot possibly account for macro-experience. And what I would say to this is that, again, riding the electromagnetic analogy, the single basic force of electromagnetism obviously does yield these multimodal results that I've been talking about. And it doesn't seem to me that all those modalities need to be present in the sort of palette sense in the electromagnetic force. I guess I should explain a little bit more on that one. Just that I don't think that it has to be the case that every single conceivable color, that just invisible light, actually has to be there in the electromagnetic force. All we need is that the electromagnetic force can result in every conceivable shade of color. So, and again, I also don't think that we need to worry about putting electromagnetic modalities end to end. You know, can we put word processing end to end with the graphics and with the sound card? I don't understand why we need things that we need that. But even if we did, qualia actually do combine in our own experience. So, you know, you're eating an apple, you've got, at least with that, you've got the flavor being a combination of the taste and the smell of the apple. So it seems to me that if, to the extent that putting qualia end to end is something that we really need, we can see that it actually does happen. McGinn, though, has this other concern. But you can't get pains from experiences of color. And he's very anti-synesthesia, which would be a nice little way of getting around this. So let's just see if we can do it without synesthesia. doesn't seem like you can get word processing from artificial light, just like you can't get pains from experiences of color, but you don't need to. Both of these actually just emerge from certain electromagnetic combinations and organizations. And nor again do I think that word processing and artificial light need to be full-body properties, as McGee says, of the underlying simple charges of the electrons from which they ultimately emerge. I really don't think that the electromagnetic force contains word processing, contains artificial light in this sort of palette sense. Again, they don't need to be present in the ultimates. I would say that you could maybe then analogize this to sense modalities and say that we don't really need to have cognitive phenomenology, olfactory phenomenology, and echolocation phenomenology all actually there in the ultimates. And thus we would dissolve the palette problem and hopefully solve some of Pat's concerns. But I don't think, again, that we can do any of this if we can't sort of imagine the ultimates. I've always loved this as a sort of illustration of possibly how panpsychism works. You can think of that as a single ultimate, maybe that's the whole universe, but it's mathematically it's called a torus and torsion, and you can pretty much see what it's doing and maybe already see where this is going. So the argument from imagination, here is that I can't even imagine what it would be like to be a quark, so panpsychism is crazy. What is it like to be an electron? Yeah, I just can't imagine it. Fine, but you know, we really can't imagine the infinitesimal physicality of an electron either. I can't, and I would suggest that you all try it. And seriously, like, try it. And when you're doing it, don't forget you have to have that nice quantum smear stuff in there too. So, can anyone here really imagine? Maybe you did, I don't know. But to actually imagine it in a way that makes sense. Can we really, as it were, think that small? I don't think that we can, even in the case of the physical stuff that we know to exist as physical ultimates. So, fine, we can't think that small. You can't imagine what it's like to be a quark. You can't imagine what it's like to be an electron. This is really an argument against panpsychism, no more so than it should be an argument against physicalism. But still, as I say, it would be nice if we could come up with something, even if we can't really properly imagine it. And there are certainly a little thought exercises you can do to help yourself understand the physical nature of an electron. So, all right, let's give it a shot. And again, because I really do feel that if we don't have some sort of account of what the micro subjects and experiences are going to be like, I don't see how either of these first two problems are going to be answered either to our satisfaction or certainly to anyone who's skeptical of panpsychism. It is, again, we can't get from A to B if we have no idea what A is at all. I also think that McGee's right, again from the same Hard Questions article in response to Galen, that the watered-down, faint, and blurry qualia would be a cop-out here. I kind of feel the same way about an experience qualia. So I think we need to just, there has to be something really qualitative there. I sort of had this thought as I was just finishing this up, that maybe this is also kind of troublesome because of Dave's arguments about fading qualia. I know that was in a different context, but it seems as though that's, you know, that's kind of what McGee said. We can't just say, oh, well, that's the ultimates just have faded qualia. So I think where this is, you can probably tell where this has been going, because I've been saying that all of these modalities can come out of the ultimates. I think that we could kind of solve these problems if we posit sort of supersaturated, undifferentiated, uber-experientiality in the ultimates. I used to think that maybe that kind of meant something like the traditional answers to the palette problem, where you either cram every single conceivable phenomenal state into one type of ultimate, or you've got, you know, like the 6 types of quarks are going to correspond to the 5 senses plus cognitive phenomenology or something. I think that the way to get started with it, though, is think that maybe what it's like to be an electron is something like everything at once. Be it hot, cold, falling, rising, red, green, pain, pleasure, believing panpsychism, disbelieving panpsychism. And so when we move down the scale, the evolutionary scale, the scale of complexity to the ultimate, we're not really approaching a blackout as we would normally think of it. We're actually approaching a whiteout, this rather than, as we kind of, it's very hard not to think of it because it's called the combination problem. It's not going to be a matter of combination or addition. Right, yeah, it's going to be differentiation and subtraction of this one thing. And again, that doesn't mean that you're subtracting out in the sense of actually all of those potentially infinite phenomenal states are really in there, in the electron, or whatever the ultimate is, but they can come out of it somehow. I also found this one a little bit light, so to speak, but see what you think. Here's a scientific explanation. Near-death experiences just got off of a Huffington Post Talk Nerdy to me article called "What Happens When You Die." They're quoting this David Chalmers, and it's not really a full quote, but I'll take their word for it that they did a good job of the journalism or whoever they stole it from. A white light at the end of the tunnel is the only thing we can really expect a person to see as they get closer and closer to death. So again, approaching white out, not approaching black out. Given that the rest of the higher brain regions are essentially shut down, if the visual areas are suddenly activated, no higher level of processing can exist, and a bright light is all we would be able to see. To me, that suggests, on the surface at least, that the high-level phenomenal richness, the technicolor quality of vision, is actually, again, a matter of differentiation and subtraction from this white light experience. That's, I guess, the basic thing that the visual areas do in the absence of the higher brain regions, rather than a matter of combination. And so I would wonder, again, can we maybe generalize to all modalities? This is where it does get a little bit tricky, because then you are basically saying that, yes, sight, sound, smell, cognitive phenomenology work the same way as red, yellow, blue, orange, purple. It takes it up one level farther. But I think, again, it's better than trying to have up quark speed sight and charm quark speed cognitive phenomenology or whatnot. Here's another really good example of how this works in practice is polyphonic, this one happens to be polyphonic, subtractive analog synthesis. Jupiter 8, of course, the most legendary of all of these types of synthesizers. And it's actually, the process is called subtractive analog synthesis. Got this off of Apple's website for their little synthesizer program. And they say, and I'm sure everyone's heard this story, according to legend, when Michelangelo was asked how he managed to carve David out of a block of stone, he replied, "I just cut away everything that doesn't look like David." In essence, this is how subtractive synthesis works. You filter and cut away the parts of the sound you don't want to hear. In other words, you subtract parts of the frequency spectrum consisting of the fundamental tone and associated harmonics. The fundamental tone being that top left on the oscillator with those three different waveforms. Now there's three different waveforms, and maybe this is sort of like, so that the top one is vision and the bottom one is cognitive phenomenology. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. There is just one oscillator after all, and it can do these three different things. But the important thing is that from any of those waveforms that you pick, that you make the oscillator do, you then run it through a filter and do some other stuff to it, and you end up getting synthesized sounds that can sound very, very different one from the other. And you wouldn't necessarily guess pre-theoretically if you just heard somebody playing different voices on a synthesizer that say they all came from that same type of oscillator. And then, of course, what happens with the polyphonic synthesizers is that you'll have multiple oscillators. So you can have one that's set to the top one's the gate or whatever that's called, and then you've got sawtooth and whatnot, maybe a sine wave. You could have